When two leaders who once stood on opposite ends of the political earth suddenly speak with the same voice, history tells us to stop and pay attention. Donald Trump, the most outspoken figure of America's conservative movement, and Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the young revolutionary reshaping the political heartbeat of Burkina Faso, have never shared a common worldview. One defends Western power, the other challenges it at its very core. And yet, within just 2 short weeks, both men raise their voices against the same person, President Samia Suluhu Hassan of Tanzania. This is not a coincidence, and it is not a small story. Samia was once seen as a quiet, steady leader, but today, her name is tied to allegations that shake the future of East Africa itself. Accusations of election manipulation, the suppression of civilians, secret ties to armed rebel networks, and an $83 billion energy deal that could fracture regional unity. So the question is no longer, what happened in Tanzania? The question now is, why did two former opponents, Trump and Traoré, find themselves calling out the same threat? And who stands to gain from this growing divide? If you believe Africa's untold stories deserve the truth, stay with me until the end. For many observers, the turning point began not with violence or war, but with a report dry, technical, and quietly devastating. An international election monitoring group based in Mauritius released findings that shook the political ground beneath Tanzania. According to their assessment, the nation's most recent election contained deep structural irregularities. More than 40 voting districts reported unexplained alterations to ballot counts, independent monitors were blocked from polling stations, and several opposition candidates were detained in the hours before citizens went to the polls. For Donald Trump, a man whose political career has been defined in part by accusations of election fraud, both claimed and confronted this was more than a headline. It was a warning. He described the situation as a textbook example of power being abused in Africa, a phrase that quickly captured the attention of Western media outlets already sensitive to global democratic backsliding. But while Trump approached the controversy through the lens of electoral legitimacy, Ibrahim Traoré saw a different kind of threat emerging. From his position at the center of Africa's new sovereignty movement, Traoré argued that any election lacking transparency undermined not just Tanzania, but the entire vision of a unified and self-reliant Africa. In his words, "A continent cannot rise if its foundations are built on uncertainty and fear." Then came the second wave of revelations. A human rights organization in Nairobi released a dossier documenting 14 disappearances in Dar es Salaam, alongside evidence of violent crackdowns on peaceful protests. Photographs, eyewitness statements, and internal testimonies pointed to a troubling conclusion. The orders appeared to originate from senior levels of government. Trump condemned the reports as unacceptable behavior from a regional partner. Traoré's reaction was even sharper. The blood of civilians must never be a tool to preserve power. For the first time, their voices aligned not by alliance, but by shared alarm. But this was only the beginning. A darker layer of the crisis was about to emerge, one that reached far beyond Tanzania's borders. Just when regional leaders believed the crisis had reached its peak, intelligence briefings from East Africa introduced an even more disturbing layer. A coordinated report, circulated among several security agencies, alleged that Tanzania maintained unclear connections with the RMLF, an armed militant group notorious for destabilizing Mozambique and Malawi over the past decade. The findings were not fully verified, but the fragments of evidence were impossible to ignore. Confidential bank transfers from accounts tied to political intermediaries, cross-border recruitment networks operating suspiciously unchallenged, testimonies from defectors describing safe corridors inside Tanzania where the RMLF could move without interference. For most leaders in the region, these were alarming red flags. For Ibrahim Traoré, they were unforgivable. Traoré has long stood against any alliance, silent or otherwise, with armed factions threatening Africa's fragile stability. The mere suggestion that a sitting government might tolerate such activity ignited a rare public rebuke. He warned that any leader who allows militant groups to operate freely invites chaos upon all of us. Trump, meanwhile, viewed the revelations through the broader strategic lens of global security. To him, the risk was not only Africa's internal stability, but also the possibility that foreign actors might be leveraging Tanzania's position to widen their military or financial footprint in East Africa. In one statement, he suggested that unchecked militant influence in Tanzania could create openings for forces outside the region to strengthen their reach. Two men, one fighting for African self-determination, the other defending Western strategic interests, were now staring at the same threat. And their reactions, though born from different philosophies, carried the same unmistakable tone. East Africa was drifting toward danger. But the region had not yet seen the full impact of what these revelations would unleash. As the allegations spread, a second wave of political shock rippled across the region. Governments in Kenya, Uganda, Rwanda, and even Malawi began requesting urgent security consultations. None of them could ignore the possibility that a neighboring state, one previously viewed as stable, might be entangled in a network of armed actors capable of destabilizing the entire East African corridor. Diplomats quietly admitted that if the accusations against Tanzania were proven true, it would trigger one of the largest regional security crises in years. And behind closed doors, several ministers warned that a silent escalation was already underway. Increased border patrols, intelligence exchanges, and emergency reviews of joint defense agreements. Inside Tanzania, however, the reaction was entirely different. Officials dismissed the reports as fabrications, accusing rival states of orchestrating a smear campaign. But the denial only fueled deeper suspicion. If nothing was wrong, why were there financial trails? Why were recruitment activities left unchecked? Why were neighboring governments raising alarms simultaneously? International observers began to take notice. Human rights organizations demanded transparency. Think tanks in Washington and Brussels released early assessments. The African Union called for an emergency briefing. And amidst this widening circle of scrutiny, the voices of Trump v. Traoré continued to echo. Their criticisms, once viewed as separate political commentaries, started merging into a unified message. Tanzania was showing signs of losing control, and the region was running out of time. This convergence of pressure, both internal and external, pushed the controversy from a domestic Tanzanian issue into a full-blown regional crisis. But the consequences would soon extend even further into the daily lives of civilians, the stability of governments, and the fragile balance of East Africa's future. The allegations alone were enough to shake the region, but the impact was far more severe than anyone expected. In Kenya, Uganda, and Rwanda, citizens began openly questioning whether Tanzania could still be trusted as a stable neighbor. Border checkpoints grew tighter. Police presence increased in towns that previously enjoyed peaceful, open movement. Small traders who relied on cross-border markets found themselves caught in unexpected delays and inspections as fears of militant infiltration spread. Yet the political shockwaves did not stop at security concerns. They soon collided with one of the most sensitive topics in East Africa: energy. Reports emerged that President Samia had quietly signed an $83 billion energy agreement with a Middle Eastern conglomerate without notifying regional partners who depended on shared gas corridors and pipeline cooperation. For Kenya and Uganda, this was not merely a diplomatic misstep, it was a potential economic disaster. Energy ministers across the region warned that the deal could disrupt existing gas distribution plans, raise transportation costs, and weaken East Africa's bargaining power on the international stage. Citizens felt the impact almost immediately. Rising energy prices, fears of fuel shortages, and growing frustration over why such a massive deal was made behind closed doors. Inside the African Union, diplomats grew increasingly uneasy. The organization had long struggled to maintain unity among its members, and Tanzania's unilateral action risked deepening strategic rifts at a time when cooperation was desperately needed. As civil society groups called for transparency and regional leaders demanded answers, one thing became clear: the controversy surrounding Samia was no longer just a Tanzanian issue. It was reshaping the political and economic landscape of East Africa. But the damage was not done yet. A second wave of consequences was waiting just beyond the horizon. As the political storm deepened, a quieter but more painful crisis began unfolding among ordinary citizens across East Africa. In border towns stretching from Namanga to Busia, families who depended on daily trade noticed the shift immediately. Transport trucks were stopped for hours, sometimes days, as new layers of inspection were introduced. Small vendors carrying food supplies or household goods found themselves trapped in lines that barely moved. For many, it was the first time they truly felt the cost of political instability. Parents worried about increasing food prices. Drivers complained that fuel costs had risen again. Communities that once shared easy movement and cultural ties now faced walls of suspicion. Meanwhile, Tanzania's internal tensions were sharpening. Opposition groups accused the government of dragging the country into regional isolation. Religious leaders called for restraint, warning that a nation cannot thrive when its neighbors lose trust. Even local business unions, typically aligned with stability, expressed concern that foreign investment could shrink if Tanzania was viewed as an unreliable partner. In Nairobi and Kampala, the political discourse shifted rapidly. Several lawmakers demanded that East African countries reconsider joint infrastructure agreements with Tanzania until clarity was provided. Editorials in major newspapers described the situation as a self-inflicted fracture, while regional analysts warned that the entire East African community might enter its most fragile period in over a decade. Citizens across the region felt an uncomfortable truth rising to the surface. This crisis was no longer about allegations. It was about the future direction of East Africa itself. The world was beginning to watch closely, and soon, the reactions from global powers, especially the United States, would add an entirely new dimension to the unfolding drama. From Washington to Brussels, the unfolding crisis in Tanzania no longer looked like a regional disturbance. It was beginning to take shape as a strategic fault line with global implications. In the United States, analysts quickly noted the parallels between the election controversies in Tanzania and broader global concerns about democratic backsliding. Conservative commentators sympathetic to Donald Trump framed the issue as another example of authoritarian drift in a critical geopolitical corridor. Trump himself sharpened the conversation. To him, the allegations against President Samia were not merely about governance. They were about three intertwined dangers: the integrity of democratic processes, the stability of a region historically vulnerable to violent spillovers, and the rising influence of Middle Eastern financial power inside East Africa. He warned that the $83 billion energy deal could open the door to deeper external influence, undermining long-standing cooperation between East African states and Western partners. European leaders were equally unsettled. The European Union had invested heavily in stabilizing the Mozambique-Malawi corridor, an area previously shaken by militant activities linked to groups like the RMLF. The idea that Tanzania, a key transit nation, might be providing indirect support or passive tolerance to the same networks raised immediate alarms. Several think tanks in Brussels described the situation as a security blind spot with the potential to disrupt an entire region. International media outlets amplified the divide. Some argued that Samia was being targeted by foreign interests. Others insisted the evidence demanded full investigation. Diplomatic missions quietly began preparing contingency plans for potential economic or security fallout. And amid this global attention, one question grew harder to ignore. Was Tanzania drifting toward a new political alignment, or had it already crossed a line the world could no longer overlook? The answer would not remain unclear for long, because the next sequence of events would reveal the true stakes of this crisis. As the crisis deepened, the international community began reassessing Tanzania's position in global strategy. Intelligence briefings shared quietly between Washington, London, and Paris suggested that the political trajectory under President Samia might be shifting faster than anyone anticipated. What alarmed Western analysts most was not just the election concerns or the civil rights abuses, it was the pattern. A series of decisions hinting that Tanzania may be moving toward a more unilateral, less accountable model of governance. In the United States, policy advisors warned that the situation echoed past crises where early warning signs were ignored until instability spread across regions. Committees on Capitol Hill raised questions about whether U.S. development funds and security partnerships could be jeopardized if Tanzania continued down this path. The risk is not only humanitarian, one congressional aide stated, it is strategic. Meanwhile, in the Gulf, the $83 billion energy deal was being viewed very differently. Powerful players in the Middle East saw Tanzania's shift as an opportunity, a chance to expand their energy influence deep into East Africa, potentially bypassing Western oversight. Some analysts argued that Samia's agreements could anchor a long-term realignment that would weaken Western leverage in the region. China, observing from the sidelines, maintained public neutrality but increased diplomatic contact with Tanzanian officials. Russia initiated exploratory conversations on defense and infrastructure. India quietly evaluated the risks to its own energy corridors. Africa itself was divided. Some leaders defended Tanzania. Others echoed Ibrahim Traoré's warnings that instability in one state could spread like a slow-moving fire across the continent. The world was not merely watching Tanzania. It was calculating, weighing the consequences, preparing for the possibility that this crisis might reshape alliances far beyond East Africa. But just when analysts thought they understood the pattern, a sudden twist would upend the entire narrative and redefine the roles of Trump, Traoré, and Samia in a way no one expected. Just as governments, analysts, and media outlets around the world believed they had finally mapped the crisis, a new revelation shattered every previous assumption. A confidential briefing leaked from within a regional intelligence coalition suggested that the turmoil surrounding Tanzania might not have originated from Samia's decisions alone. Instead, it hinted at the presence of external political engineering, quietly shaping the narrative from behind the scenes. The document claimed that several powerful actors, some from outside Africa, had vested interests in destabilizing East Africa's energy corridor. According to the report, these interests would benefit enormously from fracturing regional cooperation, diverting energy routes, and weakening collective bargaining among African states. If true, it meant the crisis was not just political misconduct, but part of a larger contest over influence, resources, and the future layout of East Africa's strategic map. And this is where the twist became even more dramatic. Both Trump and Traoré, despite originating from opposite worldviews, had unknowingly reacted to the same hidden pressures. Their criticisms of Samia aligned not because they were allies, but because they were responding to a coordinated shift unfolding across the region, one that targeted Tanzania as the central fault line. For Traoré, the implications were immense. If external powers were actively manipulating the narrative surrounding Tanzania, it validated everything he had long warned Africa about: interference, shadow deals, and attempts to fracture regional unity. His supporters began framing him not just as a national leader, but as one of the few figures willing to expose the deeper machinery behind Africa's instability. For Trump, the twist carried another meaning entirely. He saw it as proof that geopolitical rivalries were intensifying, and that the United States could not afford to overlook regions where influence was quietly being contested. The crisis was no longer simply about Samia. It was about a silent battle for the future direction of an entire region. As investigators dug deeper, a second layer of the twist emerged, one that fundamentally changed how the entire story would be remembered. A separate intelligence memo, circulated among select African Union officials, revealed that while external powers may have attempted to influence regional dynamics, Samia's administration had also knowingly participated in several back-channel negotiations that were never disclosed to the public or to neighboring governments. The evidence pointed to confidential meetings, undisclosed financial agreements, and private assurances given to foreign energy investors, assurances that directly contradicted Tanzania's commitments to regional unity. This discovery reframed the crisis completely. Samia was not merely a leader under pressure. She had become an active player in a geopolitical chessboard that stretched from the Middle East to Washington to Beijing. But the most surprising outcome was how this revelation elevated Ibrahim Traoré's image across the continent. For months, Traoré had warned about hidden hands shaping Africa's political future. His speeches about sovereignty, transparency, for the dangers of foreign influence were dismissed by critics as the rhetoric of a young revolutionary. Yet now, with the leaks confirming patterns of manipulation and backroom deals, many Africans began seeing Traoré not just as a president, but as a guardian of the continent's awakening. Across social media in Burkina Faso and West Africa, a new narrative emerged. Traoré was the leader who recognized the threat before anyone else dared to speak it. Even Western analysts, previously skeptical of him, were forced to acknowledge that his instincts about external interference were not unfounded. Trump, on the other hand, viewed the twist as a warning of something larger, an expanding geopolitical battleground where influence was shifting faster than most Western policymakers realized. And so, The crisis surrounding Samia, once seen as a domestic Tanzanian issue, transformed into a moment that reshaped the image of Ibrahim Traoré, challenged US strategy, and exposed the depth of the power struggle unfolding across Africa. The world now understood this was never just about Tanzania, it was about the future of Africa's sovereignty. In the end, this story was never just about an election, an energy deal, or a political controversy in Tanzania. It became a mirror reflecting the deeper struggle shaping today's world, the fight between manipulation and sovereignty, between silence and truth, between leaders who serve themselves and leaders who stand for their people. As more African news platforms began connecting the dots, a new understanding spread across the continent. Voices from Burkina Faso, Kenya, Uganda, and beyond asked the same question. Who will defend Africa's future when powerful forces move in the shadows? And for many, the answer pointed toward figures like President Ibrahim Traoré, leaders who refuse to bow, who speak plainly, and who remind the world that Africa's destiny cannot be written in foreign capitals. Burkina Faso's rising confidence under Traoré became a symbol of what a united Africa could look like. His words echoed far beyond his borders. We do not ask for permission to be free. We rise to claim it. So now the question turns to you. Do you believe East Africa can restore its unity? Do you think leaders like Ibrahim Traoré represent a new path forward for the continent? And most importantly, who truly benefits from a divided Africa? If the spirit of President Ibrahim Traoré inspires you, share this story. If you believe the truth matters more than the headlines, subscribe. And if you stand with a future where Africa rises on its own terms, let your voice be heard.